Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. We are now beginning Daoism. So, this is our first recording on Daoism. Like I often do on our first day of a new reading, I'll give you some context, some background, sort of give you a foundation, because otherwise I know it can just be a bunch of random words you're not even sure where they're headed. So here's some background. Okay, Taoism is an ancient Chinese philosophy, or really, I should say, it began as an ancient Chinese philosophy, and it remains a contemporary. It has changed, of course, but it remains a contemporary philosophy, both in China and, of course, here in the U.S., for instance. I'm teaching it throughout the globe. Okay. The details of who wrote every single word and exactly when it was written and if it's ever been added to or reorganized, etc. Those are all interesting things that scholars of classical Chinese works and philosophy scholars, they write books about it. We don't need to get into that into Philosophy 100, as interesting as it is. I'll just point to a few things that might be relevant for us about those sort of issues. Okay, so this book was it was written or compiled somewhere between 600 and 400 BC. So it's around 2,500 years old. That puts it possibly before famous early Western philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, etc. But it's definitely right in their same ballpark of time. Okay, so a lot of students justifiably think, why should I care about something that some dead guy 2,500 years ago wrote or thought? Right? A lot of us think, well, this might have been good for back then, but surely we've improved upon it. What's the new version of the Tao, right? You might be asking. Why do I have to study the old one? The old one's probably worse for being older. But what I would say is this. I can't prove it to you today. I can't even give a half convincing proof of it today. But maybe you'll sort of believe it by the time we get to the end of the course. But the idea I'm just going to float today but can't really prove is that in philosophy, just because something is old, it doesn't make it bad or doesn't mean that it needs to evolve and change to get better. Okay? Think of philosophy in terms of age and history as more like art than science. Okay? Science and technology are basically always getting better. We don't invent a new engineering technique. We don't revise our scientific theories to make them less accurate, less able to control the world. So they do in fact progress. I'd rather have a water treatment system from modern America than from 1800s America, right? Because that's science and tech. They do in fact get better as time goes on. But philosophy is more like art. If you like Shakespeare, you wouldn't like him better if it was more contemporary. The age of something like the Mona Lisa, Shakespeare, famous ancient Greek plays like Oedipus Rex, right? These things don't get better or worse over time. If they're good in 500 BC, they're probably still going to be good and have meaning for us today. Again, I can't prove that. I'm just throwing it out there. I and most other people think that philosophy is more like art. It's somehow sort of timeless and can speak to us across generations, across literal millennia, 2,000 years. And so it's not this sort of progress model that science and technology do have. It's just different. Okay. So old philosophy doesn't mean bad philosophy. New philosophy doesn't mean good philosophy. Nonetheless, we will be reading more recent philosophers than Taoism. A bit like how, you can use Socrates and Plato interchangeably in our class because Plato wrote about Socrates. You can use Daoism or Laozi. You can use the name of the person who wrote this, Laozi, or what he wrote about, Daoism, or the name of the book, Daoism, interchangeably. Okay, you will never lose points for me if you switch from one sentence talking about the book Daoism and then later say the name of the person, Laozi. I don't care. Okay, just so you know, I in the recording will probably say all three: Daoism, Daoism, the name of the book, and Laozi, the person, interchangeably. We're all talking about the same stuff. It'll work out fine. Okay, just a little more context here, and then we'll get into the reading. You remember in the introduction, the translator said that she translated 4 different versions of this, and I let you pick which version you wanted to do, A, B, C, or D. Okay, I picked version A, so when I'm quoting, I'll be quoting from that version. The number sections will be the same. Okay, so each version, A, B, C, D, has the same section 1. It makes it easy to read in any version and still compare them. Okay. I chose the one that's the female sage, not the male master ones, the ones with male or master. Partly it was the one up front, but really I changed it, I picked it because ancient Chinese didn't have genders built into most or any of their words. So it's still an accurate and faithful translation to translate all this stuff as a female or a male, and either the sage is the one who knows or the master who has the power to live well. It's the same thing about translation. It can work either way. So don't worry if my quote says she does and yours says he does. It doesn't matter. Okay. Once more, the introduction I gave you should be helpful on this, but I just want to make it clear that Dao is a word that can be translated lots of different ways depending on the context or basically the sentence in which it resides. So Dao primarily usually means way or path. Guide, either as a noun, like a guide, a person who is a guide, or guide like a verb, something that guides you, or to be guided. Okay? And it also means flow. I'll read a quote later about how we should be like water because the Tao is like water, it flows. Okay? This is both something rewarding and something sort of difficult about Daoism, and actually about lots of philosophy written in a foreign language. Sometimes the key term, right? It's called Daoism because the Tao, way, path, guide, flow, is the central concept. But, it doesn't get translated the same way, so the central idea gets translated or shown in a bunch of different ways. That can be difficult, but it just happens translating older readings sometimes, but also it's very Taoist, right? That you can know exactly what they mean when they say Tao or path or flow. But it's hard then to express, well, should it be flow here and not path, or path and not guide, right? You can get exactly what Laozi, the Daoism, Daoism says when they say Tao, but it's really hard to pick it out and nail it down the same way every time, right? So just know that as a fact, that it means all these related but slightly different things. And also know that I will sometimes just say Tao without translating it for that exact reason. Sometimes you need to figure out what kind of Tao it might be there, right? Or sometimes it's like, well, path isn't quite the right word here. I'll just say Tao and they'll figure out what I mean. Does that make sense? Okay. So part of the reason we're reading the Tao Te Ching, this book about the virtue of the way, is that it really shows well one key side of what philosophy is. Some of philosophy deals with questions so big that you can't quite explain them, right? If I ask you what you had for lunch yesterday, I sure hope that you can explain that clearly and quickly to me. And that I would not be confused by what you said, right? Because it's a little question. It's also, frankly, not very important what you had for lunch yesterday. Probably. But some questions are so big and so important. Like if I say, what's the meaning of life? What was there before the universe existed? These questions are so important and so big that we can't quite wrap our minds around them. We definitely can't quite wrap our hands around them. Okay? So if I ask you that question, I bet I might be confused by what you say, and I bet it takes a heck of a lot longer than when you explain what you had for lunch yesterday. Okay? Now, what I'd like to say is this is a feature, not a bug, right? It's a benefit, not a problem. Some philosophy says for specific ideas, we're going to have to sort of intuit them. We're going to have to sort of fuzzy feel our way into the question and answer, right? Some philosophy is going to say it's better, not worse, to leave certain ideas half explained, not completely unexplained, but not fully explained either in the way that you could fully explain what you had for lunch. Okay? So that's part of why we're doing this. Is it starts right from the beginning. It says the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. There's something about it that's sort of extra, bigger than us, that we can't nail down in a few sentences. Okay? So it's doing that deliberately, and that's part of what some philosophy does. Ask the question so big that they don't even expect to get exact answers out of their questions. Okay. But hopefully some of you are saying at this point, wait a second, Professor. You told us that philosophy isn't just, vague opinions about things. It's arguments, it's proof for ideas, it's trying to back up everything you do. But now, Professor, you're saying that the squishy, fuzzy answers are part of what philosophy is, and that's important. I can see how it sounds like I might be saying two opposite things. Philosophy can be squishy, and philosophy also wants to be precise and give hard evidence for its claims. Okay? But there's a few things. One is you'll notice I'm being very precise with my language. It matters to be precise. I said some philosophy thinks we should ask questions so big that we can't quite nail them down. Okay? I didn't say all philosophy does that, or that philosophy only does that and therefore cannot give evidence, support, etc. There's a really big difference between saying philosophy and all of it does XYZ and saying some philosophy does XYZ and some doesn't. Okay, so that's one way I'm not contradicting myself, even though it sounds like I'm saying two opposite or contradictory things. Okay? Another point is this, is that philosophy, one way to think about it is trying to fully explain or know everything. Okay, that's one way to think about philosophy. So that should cover what I said before, that philosophy always tries to know and give evidence for things, not just have an opinion. Okay? But what happens when you try to fully explain or know everything, you still might come across very specific concepts or ideas, not everything, but specific ideas that you discover can't be explained. Okay, so you can still try to fully explain and know everything that can be fully explained or known, and then sometimes you might bump up against something and go, well, that can't be philosophically explained to the 100th degree. I can only explain it to the 75th degree. Okay? So think of it this way, just a random example, but a historian might explain to you why through history they can't explain some historical fact about the past, right? They might say, just a made-up example, they might say, we don't know what killed Napoleon because we don't have access to his body, okay? And so what they'd be saying there is they say, in general, history can tell you what killed someone, right? But here we can't. We can give you a historical reason. We don't have a body to look at. We can give a historical reason for why we can't give a historical reason about his death. Does that make sense? Okay, so Daoism doesn't just say, the Tao is hard to explain. It says, here is why. Here's my evidence or support for the idea that the idea of the Tao is hard to explain. Does that make sense? Okay. Absolutely. If it doesn't, and or you want to hear more about this, just send me an email. Okay. So one final little twist on this I'm going to say is that some philosophy does what's called metaphysics. And you've probably heard this word before, metaphysics. In philosophy, metaphysics is when you ask the big questions. Okay, big questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? Or why does the universe exist? Why is there just not empty space? Asking big questions like, are humans the same as nature? Are we basically smart animals? Are we supernatural, where there's something heavenly or non-animal in us? Or are we maybe even anti-natural and perverse? So some people think that humans are sort of anti-nature, and that's why we destroy the environment, we drive other animals extinct, etc., because we somehow don't fit in this world. Okay? Big questions are what we call metaphysics. We ask questions like, does the world end or begin? Is the universe made up of one thing, physical bodies, matter and energy? Or is it made up of two things, minds and physical matter and energy? Okay, those really big questions are called metaphysics. We'll see some metaphysics in the reading today. And again, I want you to try to have some patience with these big metaphysical ideas. Sometimes they can't possibly get quite as much support as a smaller idea because they're just working at a different level, right? Okay. So again, this sort of deliberate fuzziness on certain specific ideas is what some philosophy does. Other philosophy, like say René Descartes, is not going to work this way. Certain philosophy does, and Daoism is one of those kinds of philosophy. Okay. Last little bit of context. Daoism is from China. We want to be careful not to assume that what's often called Eastern philosophy, because China, relative to the US and Europe, is to the east, although it's also to the west of the West Coast, whatever. But we want to be careful not to assume that Eastern philosophy is just like Western, European, American, etc. philosophy. We don't want to assume that Chinese philosophy is going to be just like Western philosophy. But we also don't want to assume that it somehow is so totally foreign that it can't fit or that Western people can't use it. Okay? I'm just going to leave this as an open question. If you really want to do what's called comparative philosophy, where you compare ancient to contemporary ideas and Eastern to Western ideas, we're going to need you to get into other philosophy classes in addition to Philosophy 100. Okay, you can always ask me about these kinds of questions, but just know I'm not going to solve for us today this question of whether Eastern and Western are the same or different. I'm just going to point out that it's something you should think about. Don't force them to be identical in your mind, but also don't force them to be sort of completely opposites. Okay? All right. So that's enough context about Daoism. I'm going to stop this first recording here, let you dwell on anything I've just said, get up and get a Gatorade or a Diet Coke or whatever you're drinking, and then come back to the next recording. Okay? All right. Thank you, everyone.